Hello and welcome to the Metal Collector. Tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about the birth of the Danish metal scene. Stay tuned. Good evening everyone and welcome to the Metal Collector once again. Thank you for tuning in. Well, this video, the idea for this is because that someone mentioned in the comment section on one of the other videos I did if I could tell more about some Danish bands and releases, and yes, I would love to, because I like to talk about the Danish metal scene and what kind of bands we have here. So I have been thinking about doing this Danish Metal Specials, a little series here, which I will do from time to time. And I was thinking that if I was going to do this, I could, why not start from the beginning and tell about how the Danish metal scene started. And I'll try and keep it short because I don't want this video to be, an hour, 2 hours long. So I'll just try and do it the fastest way I can. So I've been making some preparations and I hope you are in for a little trip down memory lane. Before I begin, I would like to do a couple of shout-outs. First of all, René from Holspa Metal. Check out his channel. Thank you for your shout-out in your latest video. He's doing a lot of great stuff, and I bet you already know him. If you're looking at this, then you probably are here because of him or one of the other guys. The last video he did was about the 90s music and traditional metal releases in this period, hard rock releases, and he wants to make a point that there were actually many good releases in this time, in the 90s. So that's an interesting video. So a shout out to you, René. Thank you for your shout out as well. Now the next one goes out to MetalBen's Chronicles. He did a tribute for music collectors as well recently, and the Metal Collector was part of that tribute. So thank you very much. I'm very honored to be in that video. And finally, Dan Powers, again, a shout out to you in Canada. You also on your channel did a tribute video where the Metal Collector also was a part of that. So thank you very much. Appreciate it, and yeah, very honored again. A big shout out to the three of you. Now, let's try and do this. I am sitting right now at my computer because I have been writing some line notes, I think, to remember it all. And again, I'll try to keep it short and simple. Let's take a fast trip down to the 60s, back to the 60s here in Denmark. Okay, back in the 60s we had a term called pigtrådsmusik, roughly translated barbed wire music. The term covered beat music, bands like Rolling Stones, Beatles, The Kinks, old stuff, The Who, stuff like that. We had a couple of bands playing it at home. Most famously was the artist Peter Belli and his band The Rivals. And in the end of the 60s, we got the hippie generation. The hippie the wave exploded, and we had a lot of interesting bands back then, a lot of names. I'll only mention one name, and that is Steppeulvene. They did what people consider to be the first hippie rock record here called Hip, and that is a cult album today. After this, in the 70s, we had the most famous rock band here in Denmark were Gasoline. I don't know if any of you know this band, but they were pretty well known here in Scandinavia, especially, and in Denmark. And the perhaps most famous Danish musician in our generation, Kim Larsen, was the lead singer and guitar player in that band. So Gasoline. And this is in the 70s where the Danish metal story begins. But there is one album I will mention before we go into the birth of the Danish metal. And this is the album by a band called Moses. Now, I discovered this band 2 years ago, and this is the only release they did, as far as I know. I was in the local record store, and the owner was listening to this album, and it is very hard, old blues rock. And I asked him what band it was, and he said it's a band called Moses, and I said, okay, they have a pretty old school sound. Where they're from? And he said they were from Denmark, and I said, okay, and he said it was released in 71, and I was just like, wow, okay, I've never heard about this band, and I've never heard about this release before. 71, and this hard blues rock they played, almost, the production on this sounds a little bit like the first Black Sabbath album's production. I was totally, holy Christ, is this Danish? So it's not that this album was important regarding the Danish metal birth, but I just find it funny that we had a release that dated back to 71, where they played actually pretty hard, pretty heavy for its time. So the album is called Changes. I don't think you will find the original LP vinyl version of this album because, I don't know how many copies, but I know that it's probably pretty expensive if you want the original one. This is a re-release. It's called Changes, like I said, and it's a combination between Danish lyrics and English lyrics. So I just wanted to mention this album because I think it's a bit funny. Speaking of heavy Danish releases. Now let's move on to the first stone in the wall of the Danish metal story. Back in 1977, there was a young punk band formed in Copenhagen called Bratz, and the members of Bratz were a guitar player called Hank the Wanker, better known as Hank Sherman. I don't know why Hank the Wanker, pretty funny name, his artist name, and then he later changed his name to Hank Sherman. You know that guy, I presume. If not, I'll come to that. And there was a bass player and a vocalist called Jens, and there was a drummer called Monroe. Those three started Bratz, and they had a couple of other guys coming in and out of the band before a young guitar player also came in some time after that. They were actually planning to release the debut album in 79, but that never happened. This is a vinyl containing the songs that were supposed to be their debut album. And as you can see, there were only the three founding members of the band. This is released under the name The Lost Tapes. It's quite good if you're into old punk. I like it. But like I said, another guy came into the band. His name was Michael Denner. I bet you have heard about him as well. He was a guitar player, and he and Hank Sherman teamed up the best way possible. And instead of releasing these songs, they, in 1980, they released this instead. They had been writing on some new stuff, new material, and this classic piece came out in 1980, called 1980. 1980 by Bratz is the first milestone in what was known as metal in Denmark. It is a punk release, but it also contains a lot of metal kind of ideas. The two guitar players were very inspired by the 70s harder bands and the new wave from Britain, the new wave of British heavy metal. So this is, if I had to describe this album, I would say, if you don't know it, this is a combination between some Ramones sounding punk combined with some Dead Boys sounding punk and some influences from the new wave of British heavy metal. And I like this album very much. It's a good album. And when it was released, the punk community just embraced it, and as well with the metal guys we had in Denmark at that time. They were also pretty happy for this album. So it became an instant classic. This copy I have here, I was giving, there was an old colleague of mine who gave me this because the cover was totally ruined. It was brutalized by a water damage in his basement. He had it in some boxes. So he was, I think he was about to throw it out anyway. So I said, well, no, don't do it. It's the original LP version of 1980. I want it. I was looking for this. So I can live with the broken cover until I find another copy of it in a better shape. And as goes for the vinyl itself, there is a couple of scratches here and there, but it's pretty okay. So this is the original CBS prints of the album, and I'm pretty happy to have it in my collection. So after the album came out, Michael Denner decided to leave Bratz to form his own band called Danger Zone, and they got a new guitar player called Carsten van der Volsing, I think that was his artist name, and he came in on guitar. And Hank Sherman had a vision about the band. Now, the small metal influences, he would follow the direction of even more metal and step away from the punk. So he was looking for a singer that could fulfill the spot as being a metal singer and not a punk singer. So he was searching, and he found what he was looking for in a band called Black Rose, a Copenhagen-based rock band they were mainly inspired by bands like Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, and Golden Earring and stuff like that, with the Hammond organ and all that. And it was King Diamond's first band. Kim Bendix Pedersen, better known as King Diamond. That was his band at the moment. And they never released anything at that time. But King Diamond found some old rehearsal tapes in his basement or in the attic or something. And in 2001 he decided to release this album, King Diamond and Black Rose, 20 years ago, A Night of Rehearsal. This is a very good album, and it's very good sound, thinking of it was a rehearsal tape. And you can get an idea of what kind of band it was. I like this stuff, and I would say luckily he decided to leave Black Rose to follow Hank Sherman in Bratz, but unfortunately there was never anything released with the band itself except for this 2001. So if you're a King Diamond fan, get a copy of this album. It's a good album. You can listen to King's vocals from the early days. I don't know if Hank Sherman knew King Diamond at this time personally, but he was apparently thinking he was the right choice for a vocalist for Bratz and the musical direction he wanted to do with the band. And King Diamond, like I said, he left Black Rose, they dissolved, and he became a member of Bratz. A little story about this band. Actually, they had some cult following on the live front. If you're reading the line notes by King himself, he writes that already then they had some pretty crazy gimmicks during concerts. They have always had an intro song. It's the song Soul Overture, pretty good. And while that played, it was an instrumental piece. And when they played that song, the band, King would be pushed up towards the stage in a wheelchair by one of their friends dressed up as a doctor. And then he would jump on stage and they would start the concert. And I think there was also something with throwing pig's eyes at audience and stuff like that. Pretty obscure for its time, even in Denmark. So that was quite some stories. King, like I said, joined Bratz, and they were writing new material, even harder and heavier, and they wanted to do the next album, but the record company CBS wouldn't allow them to release this kind of stuff They wanted the band to play a little bit more melodic, a little bit softer rock, and with Danish lyrics. For this time, it was pretty modern in Denmark to sing in Danish. But of course, King Diamond and Hank Sherman said no way. So they dissolved Bratz and started up Merciful Fate. And now we're by the first actual metal band here in Denmark, what is considered to be the grandfathers of Danish metal, Merciful Fate, in the first constellation. They also brought Carsten van der Volsing from Bratz with them, and instead Jens and the drummer Monroe, what I've heard, they started a new band called the New Bratz. I've never looked into that story. I don't know what they did or if they did anything. But Merciful Fate started, and in 1981 they recorded, I think it was 3 demos, and there was a lot of lineup changes in this period. I think there was a drummer on the first demo called Jan Musen or something, and the bass parts for the first demo was played by Hank Sherman himself and Carsten. Now in Michael Denner's new project Danger Zone, he also did a couple of demos, one in 81 and I think the next one was in 82. And the rest of the lineup for those releases was actually Merciful Fate guys, and he knew Hank Sherman, so he teamed up with him and the rest of the band. And of course not Carsten, who was going to be replaced by another guitar player called Benny Petersen, that was on the EP Burning the Crosses, as far as I remember. I don't have any of these releases, unfortunately. They're hard to find, and again, it's Merciful Fate, and it's a collector's item today, so they are very expensive if you want to buy some of them. I don't even know how many copies they were made in. But anyway, in 82, Michael Denner joined Merciful Fate as the new guitar player, and at this time they had a permanent bass player in Timmy Grabber, that also is a part of the classic Merciful Fate lineup, and the drummer Kim Ross. So now you have the 5 original members of Merciful Fate, what we would consider to be the classic lineup. And in 82 they released the EP Merciful Fate, a very classic piece within the Danish metal scene. Unfortunately I don't have that either, but I have this CD, this release called The Beginning, which contains the songs from the EP as well as some live recordings from a radio show they did, and also a bonus track that was left over for the Melissa recordings. So this was in 82, and at this time the band had got a reputation of playing some very extraordinary concerts, King's lyrics about the satanic stuff and all the rituals and all that. It had become legendary, first here in Denmark but also outside of the country, and they played a lot of other places. I think Holland was one of the places they visit a couple of times as well. So there was some high expectations for this, and they inspired a lot of new musicians to play heavy as well. I'll come to some of them in a little bit. I'll just tell you that in 83 this was released, the debut album of Merciful Fate. This is one of the biggest milestones, if not the biggest, when we talk about Danish metal. Melissa. I love this album, and I appreciate it in any way. I love all the songs, especially the title track is one of my all-time favorites. And the whole mystery about this album, it's just a great album. And I bet if you are a King Diamond fan, or at least just have heard about Danish metal, I bet you have heard about Merciful Fate, and I would almost bet anything that this is one of the albums you have heard of. Melissa. Great album. And we can just as well move along to 1984. They released the follow-up, Don't Break the Oath. At this time, Merciful Fate were big, not just in Denmark. They were big influences on many bands, many places in the world. And Kings, you know, the corpse paint and the inverted cross and everything. It just, yeah. This album is just as great, in my opinion, as Melissa. I think those two albums belongs together. It's almost like a brother and sister album. Dangerous Meeting, Desecration of Souls, Gypsy of the Oath, Comes to the Sabbath, classic on classic. Again, one hell of an album, and I think if you have heard about Danish metal or Merciful Fate or King Diamond, you have heard this album. Like I said, Merciful Fate, they inspired a lot of other musicians to start playing metal, and even though they didn't sound just as dark as Merciful Fate or had the same kind of vocals or anything, they were a big inspiration for many of these musicians, especially in Copenhagen. And I will now tell a little bit about some of these bands. We had Witchcross. This is the debut album, also released in '84. I will say that 1984, I would consider that to be the golden year of the 80s period of metal in Denmark. Like I said, Don't Break the Oath was from '84. This album, the debut from Witchcross, Fit for Fight, is from '84. A little funny thing I will just tell you now is that the band was called Blood Eagle and released one demo before changing the name to Witchcross, not to be confused with we also have a new Danish band called Blood Eagle. They don't have anything to do with each other, but anyway, Blood Eagle one demo, and then they changed the name. When they changed the name, they also got a new guitar player, a second guitar player in the band. And that guy was a guy called Ole Hamilton, who had a band called Mandrake. This is a vinyl containing the Mandrake demos. Mandrake never released anything, so all the old material was collected by High Roller Records and released on this a couple of years ago. And this is I love this. This is, for me, I'm a huge collector of Danish metal, and you know, I really love stuff like this. This is history. This is Danish metal history. And this was his band. You can say that roughly. He was the main writer in the band, and he had problems finding the right guys for the lineup. So in the end, he decided to call it a day and joined Witchcross instead. But two of the songs from the demos followed him, and the song, 2 seconds here. Yeah, the song We Will Be Strong is the song Rocking the Night Away, which would be regarded as perhaps the biggest classic from this album. They also did a video for the song. And the song Alien Savage from the Mandrake period is also on this album in a little different version. So, but this is also a classic, talking about old Danish metal albums. It's just heavy metal with a hard rockish edge to it. Also released in '84, Wasted's debut album, another Copenhagen-based band, Halloween, The Night Off. This is also a little bit dark, heavy metal with some small speed metal inspirations. On this edition I got from Demonation Records. There is also what was meant to be the second album, Final Convulsion. It was supposed to be released in '85, but they never got to that, so it was never released properly. So now it's a bonus thing on this, and it's a fun and good thing to have in your collection if you're into the Danish metal stuff. But also great album, Halloween, and also the follow-up. Another band releasing their debut album in '84 was Maltese Falcon and their Metal Rush album. Again, straightforward heavy metal, a bit rough. I like this album. Kerrang magazine didn't like it. They voted this album the worst metal release ever in one of the magazines. I can't remember what year it was, but I think that was unfairly in all ways. Alive, the opening track, Rats, heavy and loud, headbanger, on fire, metal rush. It's filled with good songs. So, and on this, the bass player on this album was a guy called, his artist name on this album was Hasse Patino, but he later would be known as Hal Patino. And like many of the King Diamond fans perhaps know, he became the King Diamond bass player for some years and was involved with a lot of the albums. A little small piece I have also released in '84, Mirage from Randers, a city that lies nearby, 50 kilometers from where I live, released this single. I've showed it before in another video I did, because I think it's a fun thing to have. It's hard to find, and I found it very cheap when I bought it. So also the color of the vinyl it's fun. It's from '84. What's not to like? Shave it all off the single. There was another important band releasing their debut album in '84, and that is Pretty Mates. I guess some of you know this band. They are still around, still kicking. Red Hot and Heavy was released. Also a classic when we talk about the Danish metal. And at this time they already had got a name for themselves. They had opened for Black Sabbath in '83 in Copenhagen, and they had been, I think it was on a Britain tour or something. There is a guy I have to mention at this time. He was also the manager for Merciful Fate for some time, Ken Anthony. Some of you have probably recognized his name because he was, Lars Ulrich from Metallica always calls him his mentor. He was working at a record store in Copenhagen in these years, and he was the guy people talked to if they had to know anything about metal. He knew all about it, and he was the one that got music from other countries imported the stuff to Copenhagen, and his Bristol Music, I think that was the name of the store, and people came there and bought the things he said was cool. And Lars Ulrich, he was listening to his, I don't know, they hang out together, and Ken showed him and played a lot of the new stuff from England to him, the new wave of British metal. And Lars, of course, took off and started a band. So yeah, and Ken Anthony was also Pretty Mates manager for some time and got them a lot of great opportunities, among other things. I think it was him who got them to England to play the tour. So, but this album, again, back to back, Red Hot and Heavy, Cold Killer, Night Danger, a lot of good songs on this. And this is the EP they did before releasing the debut album. This is with a different cover than on the original version. This is the re-release of the EP, because when they released it at first, soon after, there is a story that goes that Ronnie Atkins, the singer from this band, Pretty Mates, was being interviewed by a radio station, and they asked him how well it was received, the EP, and I don't know if he lied, but the story goes that he said that it had at least sold 50,000 copies, which it didn't have. But the record company, CBS, heard about it and wrote a contract with the band immediately and re-released it with this cover. And they were also the label behind, Red Hot and Heavy. Now I think actually we are almost done with these early releases. There is some other stuff I would like to add to the birth of the Danish metal scene. Artillery, one of my all-time favorite thrash metal bands. The first album, Fear of Tomorrow, was first released in '85, but they had been around for some time and was also inspired by the heaviness of Merciful Fate. And the brothers Michael and Morten Stützer wanted to play dirty metal. They didn't like the new sound of some of the some of the music that came out at that time. Rainbow, for example, after Dio went and they released the new album, they were, okay, this is way too clean. We need something that is more brutal and aggressive. And they started writing harder material, and Artillery was born. And then they got Carsten Nielsen on drums, and he played very punkish, and then it just took off with the speed and everything. But in '84 they released 2 demos, Shell Shock and Deeds of Darkness, and that brought them attention also outside of Denmark, and they were, you know, in the first wave of new thrash metal bands in the beginning of the '80s. So they were a pretty known act around the world also. Now I have a couple of names I would like to add as well. Unfortunately, the first one is the band Evil. They did an EP called Evil's Message also in '84, I think that was the year, yeah, '84. I don't have it in my collection yet, but I'm still searching for that. I think it has been re-released also on CD, so I'll try and find it some way or another. Some of the other bands that were being formed in the early '80s was Alien Force, which also did the first debut album in '85. Randy from Randers, they never released a full album, but they released some years ago a compilation of their demos and other stuff and some live things. Great music, by the way. There was a band called Anger, Heavy Chains, Crystal Knight, Battalion. Battalion also played thrash metal, and some of the members later on was involved with Furious Trauma. That also was a Danish thrash band that also evolved into some more rockish kind of stuff. Evil Prayer as well. Crystal Knight, I think their story dates back to the middle of the 70s or something, but they changed name and suddenly they were Crystal Knight around '84 or something, and they released the first album, I think that was in '85 as well. So a lot of things was going on in Denmark around '84 and '85, and these new bands just started to rise and inspired a lot of new musicians. But I think we'll discuss more about what they inspired and all this, and what releases that was about to come in the late 80s and especially in the 90s, because in the 90s that was when death metal really broke through also in Denmark, and a lot of new bands came. So, but okay, it has been a long video. Thank you for watching. If you're still with me, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope you got something out of this video. It was fun talking about the Danish metal's creation and the birth of it, and I know I miss some bands and perhaps also have made some fails, but at least this gives you a little look on the Danish scene and the Danish birth of metal, how metal came to Denmark. So with those words I will say thank you, and see you again in another video, and I will make more of these Danish metal specials. This was the first one, the beginning. So stay heavy and see you.